Margaret Doyle never expected her simple acts of kindness to come back to her. For 7 years, she fed a homeless black boy behind the diner, giving him whatever food she could spare. But her quiet generosity led to her being framed by a jealous manager who had her fired. With no money and no one remembering her, Margaret left one final bag of food for the boy, with a note tucked inside her address, praying he'd make it. Years passed in silence, until one fall evening, a black SUV pulled up to her rundown house. When the man stepped out, Margaret froze in shock. The boy she had once helped had returned, and his revelation would change everything. Before continuing, if this is your first time watching our video, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything to us and helps us bring you more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end, and if this story moves you, drop your thoughts in the comments and share it with a friend. Now let's begin. The diner Margaret worked at always smelled of burnt coffee and bacon grease. Old liquor bottles lined the walls, and the red vinyl chairs were cracked from years of use. The sounds of conversation mixed with the clatter of plates, creating a constant buzz. For most, it was just a cheap place to grab breakfast before heading to work. But for Margaret, a 60-year-old waitress with silver-streaked hair tied in a bun, the diner was everything. She moved with quiet precision, constantly refilling cups and balancing trays, offering tired smiles even when her legs ached. Most customers didn't even notice her unless their orders were delayed. But Margaret had a secret routine that no one knew about. At the end of each shift, she'd slip out the back door with a small paper bag. Sometimes it was leftover food, sometimes something she had bought with her tips. She'd walk down the narrow alley, her shoes scraping against the pavement, until she reached the dumpster where a boy waited. He couldn't have been more than 8 when she first saw him. Dark skin, big eyes filled with hunger, his clothes worn thin against the cold. He never asked for anything. He simply stood there, shifting on his feet, arms crossed tightly as if bracing himself against the world. The first time Margaret hesitated, but when she handed him a sandwich wrapped in paper, he looked at her with disbelief. It was as if kindness was more foreign to him than hunger. And so it started. Day after day, year after year, Margaret brought him food. She didn't question him or ask about his past. She simply gave him a slice of pie when there was extra, soup when it was cold, and a carton of milk when she could afford it. Others at the diner began to notice and comment. "You're wasting good food on some stray," one of the cooks said. Another server murmured, "You'll regret it. Kids like that never remember who helped them." Margaret pretended not to hear but felt their words sting, burying them deep inside her. Still, she kept bringing him food. She began tucking napkins with little notes inside the bags, a smiley face, a "stay warm," sometimes just his name because she had asked him once, gently, and he had whispered it so softly that she almost missed it. That name was their secret. Through storms, she carried bread in her coat pocket to protect it from the rain. On hot summer evenings, she froze bottles of water for him to have something cold. Even when arthritis made her hands tremble, she still packed that paper bag and walked the alley, as though the ritual was the one thing keeping her grounded. By the 7th year, the boy had grown taller, his body filling out, but his eyes still carried the same heavy weight. He would nod at her quietly, sometimes managing a half-smile, but words were few. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was their way of surviving, and in that silence Margaret truly saw him, not as a homeless black kid, not as another forgotten soul, but as someone who mattered, even if no one else believed it. She didn't know it at the time, but every meal was planting a seed. While everyone else ignored him, Margaret noticed. She cared. The whispers at the diner grew louder. Some mocked her kindness, others rolled their eyes. 7 years? You think you're some saint? They would joke behind her back. But Margaret didn't care. She had long ago learned that the smallest, repeated acts of kindness were the most powerful prayers. So she kept walking out that back door, carrying the paper bag, never imagining how much it would mean. The diner's back office reeked of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. Behind the desk sat Mr. Clayton, the manager, his thick mustache, slicked back hair, and a smirk that never quite reached his eyes. He had a way of observing people as if they were disposable, not real human beings. Clayton observed everything around him, and recently, he had started noticing Margaret. It wasn't the tiredness in her feet or her sore back that caught his attention, but the way she silently carried bags after the restaurant closed. Too often, too quietly. He began making offhand comments when no one else was around. "Funny how food keeps disappearing after shifts," he muttered one evening, his gaze sharp. Margaret pretended to be busy stacking plates, but his words lingered in the air. The gossip from her co-workers didn't make things easier. "Maybe she's stealing pies," one cook joked from the kitchen. "No, she's feeding that street kid again," another server whispered, her voice dropping low. "I saw her once." The first cook laughed again. "Well, if she's caught wasting inventory, that's as bad as stealing." Margaret overheard everything. Her grip on the coffee pot tightened, but she remained silent. The rumors continued, casting their shadow. Then one Friday night, the storm broke. The register was short by $40. Clayton gathered the staff, pacing in front of them like a predator, his voice smooth and steady. "Someone's been taking money," he said, his eyes sweeping across the room. "And I don't have to guess who." All eyes turned to Margaret. Her heart sank. Clayton pointed at her. "You've been walking out with bags every night. Everyone's seen it. Don't play innocent." Margaret's chest tightened, and her voice wavered as she tried to explain. "That's food, not money. I've never touched the register." But Clayton cut her off with a sneer. "You think the owner cares about your excuses? You're done here." The silence in the diner was deafening, more painful than any words. A young busboy muttered to another near the doorway, "She's been here longer than all of us. They can't just throw her out like that." The other shrugged. "They just did. Clayton's been wanting her gone for a while." Margaret stood frozen, her mind racing. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to demand proof, but years of swallowing her pride had made her mute. And so she walked away. That night, her steps felt heavier than ever before. In the alley, the boy was waiting, hunched against the cold. He looked at her expectantly, eyes searching for the familiar bag. Her hands shook as she passed it to him. Inside, besides the food, she had tucked a napkin. The ink was smudged where her tears had touched it. "I no longer work here," the note read. "They said things I didn't do, but if you ever need help, this is where I live." She added her address, her handwriting unsteady. The boy stared at her longer than usual, his lips parted, as if he might say something, but nothing came out. He simply nodded, clutching the bag tightly to his chest, then disappeared into the night. Margaret remained in the alley long after he was gone. The cold pierced through her coat, and her body felt empty. She had nothing left now. No job, no security, no certainty. Only a faint hope that the boy might one day remember the address. But as weeks turned into months, and months into years, no one ever knocked on her door. Margaret learned the hardest lesson of kindness. Sometimes you give everything, and it vanishes without a trace. The winters were the first to go, the kind that bite through wool and bone. Margaret learned to layer socks, to wear a cardigan beneath her coat, and to tuck a scarf to keep the wind from creeping down her collar. Mornings smelled of menthol and bleach. She took part-time cleaning jobs, scrubbing other people's messes to pay for her own. She'd kneel to wipe baseboards, flex her hands until the ache faded, then continue. Her house was small but tidy, a faded blue with a porch that creaked like an old friend. On the fridge, beneath a magnet shaped like a pie, was a folded napkin with an address written in her shaky handwriting. She didn't need it as a reminder, but she kept it anyway, a promise to herself that if a knock ever came, she would hear it. Neighbors came and went like the seasons. New faces, new cars, new noise. Some mornings, she would hear two teens in hoodies whispering as they leaned against a fence. "Yo, that's Miss Margaret," one would say, nodding toward her. "She used to feed a kid behind the diner every day. Wild, right?" The other would scoff. "Nah. People forget. Bet that kid did too." Their voices faded as she passed. She raised a hand in a silent greeting and kept walking, her gaze noticing small details. A stray cat that wouldn't be touched, the off-key hum of the bus driver, the headline in a newspaper about a young founder raising millions. She didn't read the business sections. Coupons were more useful. At night, she brewed weak tea, listening to the radiator hiss, and watched the headlights wash over her ceiling in soft, moving squares. On Sundays, she volunteered at a church pantry, stacking cans into neat pyramids. The pastor's wife tried to press money into her hand more than once, but Margaret would smile, close her fingers around the bills, and nod toward a mother juggling twins. "Her week looks heavier than mine," she'd say. And then she would straighten the labels on cans, line up the edges, and breathe deeply when the door finally closed. Every winter, Margaret knitted one scarf, following the same pattern, slow and steady, like counting the days. She stored them in a drawer she never opened. Spring always arrived, but she continued knitting anyway. Habit, she realized, could be a kind of prayer. Some months were lean. The electric bill hummed like a low worry at the back of her mind. She picked up extra shifts, like wiping down a barber's shop after hours. The owner, always whistling, would hand her a soda. "Everything good, Em?" he'd ask. "I'm all right," she'd reply, polishing the glass until it shone. "I'm here." Gossip traveled faster than truth. At the corner store, two women near the lotto stand would whisper behind cupped hands. "She's still alone. I heard she lost that diner job over something messy." A pause. "Some folks give until they have nothing left." "Then what?" Margaret pretended to study tomatoes, testing for ripeness with her thumb, pretending she didn't hear. But the whispers landed, and she knew how to carry their weight quietly. Years passed like sunsets, slow if you watched them, gone if you blinked. The boy's face blurred at the edges of her memory, but his eyes remained sharp and clear. Occasionally, when a lanky teenager held the door open for her, there was a warmth that rose in her chest, almost a laugh. "Look at you. Look how you survived," she thought. Then the door would close, and the day would move on. On a humid July night, sleep wouldn't come. The air was thick, and the fan ticked with a tiny wobble. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed. Her fingers pressed against her knuckles as she listened to the sounds of the neighborhood. From 3 houses down, music played softly. A couple's voices floated through the air, their argument fading away, and a siren echoed distantly. She rose, padded quietly to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and rested against the counter. The coolness of the laminate against her forearms grounded her. Her breath slowed, and she felt the arrival of autumn once again. Leaves drifted down like pages, turning in the wind. She gathered them into small piles, tied them up in bags, and paused to stretch the tension in her back. Across the street, a new couple had moved in, unpacking plants, artwork, and a bike with a squeaky wheel. The man waved, and she returned the greeting with a small smile. That week at the barber shop, the barber had shared a wild story about a tech entrepreneur who'd grown up with nothing, but was now building schools. Names bounced around the shop, fast and excited. Margaret wiped the mirrors, half listening, letting the words drift past her. Schools, children, good things. She tucked the thought away like the others. Then, as the air grew thinner and the first frost touched the grass, she pulled her coat tighter, carefully buttoning it. The clouds gathered in the afternoon, heavy and low, and the sky darkened. She brewed tea, placed her mug on the windowsill, and drew the curtain back just enough to watch the street. A delivery van rolled by, its tires whispering on the damp pavement. Further down, a sedan idled before slowly pulling away. Nothing out of the ordinary. Margaret continued rolling the last bit of yarn for her scarf, measuring it with her fingers, and finishing the stitch. The room was filled with the soft sounds of the ticking clock, the hum of the fan, and the gentle tap of the ceramic cup as she set it down. She exhaled deeply, the evening light shifting toward blue. Suddenly, she heard the crackle of gravel underfoot, the kind of sound that felt different, heavier. An engine roared nearby, steady and unhurried. Margaret didn't move at first. Engines were part of the neighborhood's rhythm. Yet, her hand drifted toward the curtain, lifting it just enough to peer outside. The headlights of a dark SUV slid across the porch rail, and the vehicle eased to a stop by the curb. The hood reflected the gray sky, and the engine hummed low, as if holding its breath. Margaret's grip on the curtain tightened. She could feel her pulse, calm but steady, and she didn't feel startled, just present. She placed her scarf on the table and smoothed it flat with her palms. Standing up, she heard the radiator click, then fall silent. Outside, the SUV's engine continued its soft murmur. Margaret inhaled slowly and moved toward the door. The handle was cool in her hand as she opened it, and the chill of late autumn swept over her skin. The engine of the SUV cut off, and the silence stretched, broken only by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. A man emerged from the vehicle, tall and sharply dressed, in a suit so sleek it seemed straight from a magazine. He paused, studying the house, his gaze steady and unmistakably familiar. Finally, his eyes found hers. Margaret's knees felt weak as she asked herself, "Where do I know those eyes from?" He walked toward her with a measured pace, not rushed, but carrying the weight of years. When he reached the porch, he stopped at a respectful distance. His voice was low, warm, and layered with something she hadn't heard in over a decade. "You don't remember me, do you?" Margaret blinked, her lips parting as his silver watch caught the fading sunlight. "I can't place you," she whispered, shaking her head. A smile tugged at his lips, and for a fleeting moment, she saw not the man, but the boy, the same wide-eyed child she'd watched grow hungrier each year. The boy who nodded quietly at the edge of the alley. "I'm the kid from behind the diner," he said, his words slow but clear. "The one you fed every day for 7 years." Margaret's world tilted. Her breath caught in her chest as memories flooded back in vivid detail. The alley, the paper bags, the napkins, and the last note with her address. The boy. Tears welled in her eyes. "Oh my God," she whispered. He nodded softly. "That note you gave me, I kept it. I didn't show up then. I couldn't. I was barely surviving. But I promised that if I ever made it out, I'd find you." Margaret's throat burned with tears she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She gestured toward the door. "Come in, please." Inside, the house felt different with him there, his presence filling the space. He glanced around at the worn furniture, and the stack of unpaid bills on the side table. He noticed everything but said nothing. Instead, he turned back to her. "I made it through," he said quietly. "Tech coding, sleepless nights, hustling. Somehow it worked. I built something. People know my name now. But none of it would have happened if you hadn't kept me alive. You never once looked at me like I was trash. You didn't care about my skin color. You just saw a kid, and that saved me." Margaret's hands shook as she covered her mouth, whispering, "All I ever wanted was for you to eat. To be okay." He exhaled slowly. "You did more than that. You gave me dignity when the world took it away." The next few weeks felt like scenes from a dream. He arranged a new home for her, warm, full of light, with no peeling paint or creaking porch. He launched a business in her name, one that would ensure she was financially stable for the rest of her life. But the biggest surprise came when he revealed something larger. He had founded an orphanage. Brick by brick, it had been built in her honor. Above the door, etched in clean stone, were the words, "The Doyle Home for Children." Reporters flooded the opening ceremony, cameras flashing as he stood at the podium. Margaret sat in the front row, her hands tightly folded in her lap, her eyes brimming with tears as he pointed toward her. "If not for her," he said, his voice strong enough to silence the crowd, "I wouldn't be here today. She fed me when the world wouldn't. She believed I mattered when no one else did. She didn't look at my skin. She didn't ask questions. She just cared. And that gave me the strength to survive." Gasps rippled through the audience. Some turned to look at Margaret, clapping, others wiping their eyes. Heat rose to her cheeks, and her hands trembled, not from exhaustion, but from something richer and deeper. After the ceremony, children from the orphanage, bright-eyed and full of life, rushed toward her, tugging at her sleeves and hugging her legs. She laughed, the sound surprising even herself. For the first time in years, Margaret's heart felt full, not from wealth or recognition, but from the quiet truth that what she had given in silence had come back in ways she never imagined. The scraps of food she had carried in paper bags became something far greater than survival. They became seeds, seeds that grew into a man, a legacy, and a home for countless others. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness outlast even the darkest years. Because when Margaret fed that forgotten boy, she wasn't just feeding hunger, she was feeding hope.